Mike, as Joe was mentioning, is a founder of medical device manufacturers himself. And in 2016, his company was experiencing some problems with cybersecurity, and they were having trouble answering questions to their health delivery organization, HDO clients. And he and a couple friends sat down together and said, what are we missing? What is going wrong here? How can we do a better job of building cybersecurity into our products? And they realized that there really weren't a lot of companies who specialized in cybersecurity for medical devices. Now, in 2016, the FDA had only just released their post-market guidance. So there was still a lot of gap between, what was sort of desirable and what was being done. That unfortunately has persisted for a good long time. And really, I think a lot of manufacturers were waiting for a final pre-market guidance before saying, yep, we're actually going to commit to doing a bunch of things. That final guidance came in 2023. I joined MyCrypt in 2022 because I was really, really enjoying my work at FDA and really enjoying telling people all the things that were wrong with their devices. But as an engineer, I have to say it's not very satisfying to not be able to also say, and by the way, here are 3 or 4 different fixes. You can go figure out the trade-offs, but pick one. FDA does not allow its review staff to do that. And I really just wanted to fix the problems. I didn't just want to say, hey, I can poke holes in your thing. I can do that all day long. It's not really hard, for me at least. It's much harder to say, solution A can do this for you, but here's the caveat, solution B can do
why
this.
do you believe FDA prohibits its employees from doing that?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, the agency has a very specific mandate. It is to regulate the medical devices. If the agency were to give different manufacturers options for fixing their problems, they would have to do it evenly. And there's no good way to do that in a fair and balanced fashion. The agency is very strict with its employees about, only going for the things that they have to have in a review. They're supposed to apply least burdensome principles. And part of least burdensome includes, is it nice to have or is it necessary? If it's necessary for review, you may ask for it. If it was just interesting or you're curious, forget about it, right? You're not allowed to go there. So agency reviewers like me are really constrained from telling companies, and here's one option. You're just not allowed to do that. And it really wouldn't be fair if the agency gave advice in one area, but not in another. Maybe you just don't have any advice to give. But if you're seen as offering a different amount of support to one or a different manufacturer, that is unfair. And it would get the agency sued.
And someone would be like, oh, you lucked out, you got Naomi, and I got Bill, and Bill was just, and Naomi actually helped us, and they're, that's my competitor. So yeah, I guess it's unfortunate, but I understand it.
Fundamentally, even in the way that you ask questions, you can be giving little nudges and hints. So, you're really supposed to stick within the bounds for how FDA is supposed to ask questions. That's why they have this concept of 4-part harmony. What is it that I saw? What was missing about it? What is the reason that I'm allowed to ask you for it? And, you're supposed to repeat these elements so that it's super, super clear exactly what the agency is looking for and exactly how you can answer the question. You need to do more.
Fourth part?
Period. The fourth part. I'm absolutely terrible at 4-part harmony. What did we see? What is missing?
Why I'm asking you this question?
And why do we want it, or something like that, right? And if you actually look at the agency's self-audit with respect to 4-part harmony, they don't do a great job at it. Their own audit, which I think was shared recently by MDMA, they posted a link to reviewing the FDA audit, shows that FDA reviewers really struggle with this. It's a very artificial construct. And I was one of several who just had a really hard time with it, because it was like, I already told you that. I just didn't use this exact wording. Like, it's really, really annoying. But the fundamental aspect here is that the reviewer is supposed to tell you, in order to review your file, I need this piece of information. You didn't give it to me. Here's why I need it. Go get it and bring it to me. You're not supposed to go out and say, oh, and I'm really curious about this other thing, right? You're not supposed to do that. So I actually, when I left, received feedback from one client that I thought was really a nice indicator that I hit the good balance while I was at FDA. He said, you were strict, but fair. And I thought, good. Okay, I achieved something excellent while I was at FDA. The key with MedCrypt and the reason that I joined them is that they're really focused on understanding what FDA is asking for and helping manufacturers either design in what FDA is asking for or describe better that they've achieved what FDA is asking for. So I really wanted to work somewhere where people were not like, oh, let's just check the box and do the bare minimum, but are doing the right thing. Why? Because of things like CrowdStrike. Because when we just check the box and say, yep, I stuck encryption in there, well, okay, I stuck encryption in there, but it's not very good encryption and it's going to break. That's not helpful, right? The idea of putting security into your system is actually to secure your system, not just to say, oh, I did a thing, and then you checked a box. So that's why I joined MedCrypt. I wanted to be able to help people fix their problems. I wanted people to understand how to build cybersecurity into their processes, into their quality systems, and make it holistic, not just a set of checklists that, you know, we comply with for the purposes of compliance. Why does that matter with respect to something like CrowdStrike? Well, as we talk through the elements of what happened with CrowdStrike and what the CrowdStrike Falcon product is and how it went wrong, you're going to see a lot of shades of quality management system in here. What went wrong is largely a failure of their quality management system, and the rollout through all of the devices that were updated and had failure modes indicates not only that CrowdStrike had some failures, but that downstream, you know, the companies who are using their tool and Microsoft, quite frankly, had some failures as well. There were opportunities to catch this that were missed. And if you read their root cause analysis, you'll see some of that. So what is CrowdStrike Falcon and how is it used? When is it used? It is really a software platform that's designed to help prevent cybersecurity attacks, including malware. It's cloud delivered. It includes next generation antivirus endpoint detection and response, or EDR, cyber threat intelligence, managed threat hunting capabilities, and security hygiene. This is according to their own FAQ. What does that really mean? It's a software tool that runs on your systems. It has kernel level access to the Windows operating system, which is an important thing from a security perspective and a dangerous thing, as we see when it causes blue screen of death. And it's intended to monitor suspicious processes, programs, logins, behavior on the system. It's really recording system-related actions, not, you know, what you put in an individual file, not a keystroke logger or something like that. But it is a tool that enterprise-level IT is using to keep track of behavior of their systems, to make sure that their systems are not being manipulated by outside parties, not running malware, not being used to trigger a cascading impact of ransomware or something like that. What it is not is, you know, an end-to-end solution to protect all things. But it does have very targeted elements, and it is apparently doing a pretty good job because they have more than 20% of market share for endpoint protection as of about July of 2024, which is, of course, when the incident happened. There are something on the order of 30 competitor tools in endpoint protection today. So to have 20% of the market share suggests that this tooling is doing what companies need. And when you start to see who was impacted by this, you can see that these are really large, really sophisticated companies who were affected by it. So they've probably put it through its paces and decided that this was a system that was really going to work for them. Anything like this can happen to anyone.
Who's number two?
I don't know. I did not look that up. But the key thing here is, just because something went wrong doesn't mean that you shouldn't use the tool, right? That can happen to anyone. Any tool can have a failure mode. We'll joke about it, but like everyone who uses a Microsoft Windows machine knows that there are constantly patches rolling out to Windows because things go wrong. It is an extremely complex, right? It's a huge, massive software package, and it's full of holes. And you just plug them as they pop up and spring a leak, and it's sort of a game of whack-a-mole. So, you know, all of the things I'm going to say about CrowdStrike today are meant not to be a criticism of CrowdStrike and their product, but an emphasis on understanding what goes wrong when you're developing software of this type and understanding the things you can do to prevent these kinds of problems. And then that really feeds back to that quality system. So what happened? When CrowdStrike had their problems, it was a slow burning failure mode, right? They initially released their sensor version 7.11 in February, so it didn't immediately fail. They had a new template type that they were using for rolling out these searches to understand, what the system is doing and how it's behaving. And this new template type was tested. So it was deeply tested, and it was expected to have 21 input parameter fields. When they issued channel file 291, the template instances only had 20 input values. It was missed because the interpreter that was supposed to use this had wildcard matching. So it handled everything just fine and it didn't fail yet. This went on for months. In July, 2 new template instances were deployed. One of them did not have wildcard matching. And this is where the failure mode hit. When it attempted to access that 21st value, it led to an out of bounds memory read beyond the end of the input data array. This is a classic common weakness. You can go look it up on the CWE database. There may be more than one example of out of bounds memory reads, but this is a classic crash. Not shocking.
May I ask 2 questions?
Mhm.
May I ask first, do you believe, this is, not my field, of course, do you believe that placing a wild card match was a mistake, or no, that's perfectly normal? The mistake was just that they failed to have a wild card field in the July template.
It is not unusual to use wildcard, and I don't think it was a mistake per se to use wildcard. It was a mistake that they were not checking to make sure that the expectation for a certain number of input parameter fields matched what was actually being fed in. It was a mistake to not check that all of the locations you were sending the interpreter to in memory did not match to things that it was actually supposed to be looking at. Especially when you're writing code in C or one of its derivatives, C++, memory problems and memory reads and failure to release memory are really classically well understood problems. So functionally, if you have good coding standards, you should catch some of these things. Again, feeding back to that quality management issue,
Right.
when you look at your software development practices should be identifying some of these common weaknesses that have been identified by MITRE and looked at them and said, well, that only applies if I'm developing in C, but I'm not developing in C, so not a big deal, right? If you are developing in C, you better be paying attention to those CWEs because they really do matter. The folks at MITRE who come up with these have been doing this for a very, very long time. They really deeply understand software failure modes, and if they flag one, it's because it's real, and it's because it happens all the time. And out-of-bound memory reads do happen quite frequently, and they're easily preventable. So when you look at the root cause analysis from CrowdStrike, that's part of what they talk about. They get into a lot of details of what exactly went wrong and how could we have prevented it. And the list of mitigations is actually something like 8 pages long.
Wow. Okay. And then the other question, please, and I suspect I'm not the only one. Falcon sensor. It senses whether or not there's malware. Is it a diagnostic tool?
It is a tool that is running at the system level, and it is observing process behavior. It is observing login behavior. It is observing which processes are kicking off and how and when, and whether or not that's atypical for that particular system. So it's sort of watching the history of how that computer system is used and what processes are running on it, and observing anything that it is not expecting and flagging it as potentially causing a problem. And it, of course, is also feeding data back over the internet, so that there's consistent development of new, flags. So if there's some new behavior that it's seeing across the enterprise at, say, a particular healthcare organization, and it sees this persistent behavior of these 8 or 20 different processes, and all of a sudden there's a creeping up of a certain process that it's never seen before, it's going to flag that. It's probably going to flag it as a malware or a ransomware. And so this kind of tooling is really, really helpful for cybersecurity because it's monitoring what your stuff is supposed to be doing and flagging activity that seems out of bounds.
Thank you. Okay, and now?
And now, so what happened after all these blue screens of death? If you were trying to fly on that day, you discovered that a lot of these airlines are using CrowdStrike Falcon to protect their systems. So all of a sudden, all of their systems went through this update, started to process these new templates, and the content interpreter said, hey, where's 21st value? And it said, I can't get to it. And that led to a feedback loop where eventually Windows was like, I don't understand what I'm trying to do and I can't. And it blue screened of death. Worse, because CrowdStrike is building its tool in at the kernel level, you couldn't escape from the blue screen of death unless you followed a very specific set of mechanisms that led you into safe mode. And if you booted in safe mode but didn't remove the offending file, you still couldn't get it to come back up. You were still stuck in blue screen. So it took a little while for people to figure out. And of course, the typical user, let's say the lady standing at the airline desk, does not know what to do with a Windows system when it blue screens. They have to call their IT support desk, which was, of course, receiving 10,000 similar such calls. The IT staff will know to get you into safe mode, but they're not going to necessarily know, hey, you got to go into CrowdStrike and remove this file. There were some really entertaining memes on the internet that day saying things like, go in and rename this file. CrowdStrike is, pick a really, colorful piece of language. But if you removed the file or you renamed it so that it couldn't find itself, you resolved the problem. But you had to figure out it was CrowdStrike, which was not known at the time. So there is a fix and it is pushed out and it's clear exactly what you're supposed to do about it. And most companies have gotten all of their systems back online, but it did take a few good days for some of the companies to resolve. And of course, there's a snowball effect when you have something like this happen. But, yes, there was a comment that Southwest was immune from the CrowdStrike problem. Was that because their software was newer or more primitive? The running joke is that Southwest was running Windows 3.1. I am not certain that that is true, but I have seen some suggestions that it was actually true. Windows 3.1 was in use as long ago as 1997, maybe. That's a pretty old operating system. And so you're like, wow, was it primitive? Yeah, if it was Windows 3.1, you might say that's primitive. Having first used a Windows machine that ran off of 2 5.25 floppies way back in the day, where one was the OS being DOS, and the other was Microsoft Word or Qbert. That's primitive to me, but it's all relative, right? The companies who didn't fail,
it's not like they were on rotary dial phones. It's not as though they were on rotary dial.
Yeah, I remember those. The systems that didn't go down either weren't using CrowdStrike, or
which would be 80% of the world, but not necessarily airlines.
More than 80% of the world, or they hadn't implemented the update. Most companies do the updates automatically, though, if they're doing stuff like that. So that's where you get caught. What has been found, though, is that 99% of the systems running Falcon Sensor are back online as of July 29th. So they typically see some kind of a variance of about 1% in week over week in sensor connections. So they're back to normal, as of the end of July. That's good. It's something recoverable, but how widespread was the outage? Microsoft is indicating that the update affected 8.5 million Windows devices. That's only a little less than 1% of all Windows machines. Partly because some of these machines are running something older than Windows 10. Partly because many of the systems are like my home computer under my desk, not important enough to be running CrowdStrike Falcon on. Not being used in a way where that would be important. This is not an enterprise IT system under my desk. This is what I use to keep track of family photos and stuff like that. So I'm not running Falcon on it, and I wouldn't really have any reason to run Falcon on it, right? This is an enterprise IT set of software. But if 1% of Windows machines are running CrowdStrike and they all went down, that is a big deal because CrowdStrike is 20% of the ecosystem. So there's only another, 24,000, 32,000 machines out there running software of this type in totality. And we brought 20% of them down. What does it mean?
Because I think in terms of market share and stock prices, I have to think that they lost almost no share over this, that the switching costs out of Falcon and to find a system that's comparable are so high that hey, everybody, sorry, and I'll, give you a free month. I can't help but bring up a 1997 Super Bowl ad. It was from CompuServe, and it was the whole 30-second commercial was the screeching sound of a modem of people trying to get online on America Online. And I thought, whoa, that is so badass. And I was like, wow, America Online stock is going to crater before it like went up 30 times or something like that. And I bring up this analogy because, and this is not stock advice, and check with your financial advisor, et cetera, but everyone kicked the shit out of the stock because this was tragic. Okay. I have to believe we'll get over it, and we're still going to have 20%, and we're still going to, grow, because cybersecurity is only, I mean, you can take it from there.
I'll take it a step further. If I were one of the clients using CrowdStrike and I had just experienced this outage and I was now recovered from it, and I was taking a look at what happened, and I reviewed their root cause analysis, and I saw the comprehensiveness of their understanding of what went wrong and what they could have done better, I would feel more confident about using their tooling than ever, because you better believe that they went back and implemented a whole bunch of CAPAs after this happened. And that means that they're in a more robust situation than they were before. And if I was relying on them before, I should trust them even more now. Does that mean that their competitors aren't doing a good job? No. They just haven't had that little speed bump in the road that they're going to hit eventually. Everybody's going to hit it eventually. That's just my opinion. We're human. We write code. Stuff happens and it goes wrong, right? It just means that these guys have hit their speed bump. They've spent a good long time navel gazing and reflecting on what went wrong, and they fixed a bunch of things because of it. And they're going to be a lot more careful in the future. And when we talk about some of the remediations, it will become obvious that their overall ecosystem is now more robust because of it. But what else does it tell us? It tells us that our interconnectedness of all of our systems today are so critical and so important to us that there's a risk involved. And that is, I'm reliant on global cloud. Well, what happens when the cloud goes down? Well, that never happens, except, I recall a year ago or so where, Amazon Web Services on the East Coast went down for a good bit. Like, it does happen. The availability is very, very high, but it's not perfect. The software platforms we rely on, our security vendors, other software vendors, our customers, and all of these downstream systems that utilize these components, they're incredibly interdependent. So we have to look at our supply chain and say, what could go wrong? Well, for me, because I operate from, a work perspective off of a MacBook and connected to Google Cloud, and some of my clients share over Azure and some share over AWS, and we're all using, SharePoint and Teams and all these other tools. If one of those tools fails for me, a third of my day is ruined. And that's a third of my day. Do I have a means of backing stuff up? You bet. I'm a belt and suspenders engineer. I save copies on my local hard drive and work off of them when the internet goes down or whatever it is. And we had a pretty long internet outage not that long ago on the entire East Coast as well. You just get used to poop happening and figuring out how to deal with it, right? But we have to plan for this stuff. We have to be prepared for the interconnectedness that makes it easy for us to do our work in a virtualized environment, highly networked, to go down and for us to be able to deal with it. It looks like there's a comment. There's an old sales adage that a problem correctly addressed inspires more customer confidence than never having experienced a problem. I feel that acutely as an engineer. I learned more in engineering school and in practice when I used to be a defense contractor and building radars. I learned more from my mistakes than I learned from sitting in lecture
What a
halls.
fascinating background you have. Just casually mentioning your engineering, your FDA, and this and
Yeah,
that.
I mean, if you can't tell from the bookcase, I'm a
You
bit
have
of
a few books back there. Actually, it's funny. We have a member who has a background like yours, only his is a laminate poster of books.
Oh, these are
But it looks as though
unfortunately,
yours are real books.
fortunately or unfortunately, they're all real, and they reflect a wide variety of interests. So there's all sorts of stuff back there. But the bottom line in this field is that we rely on interconnectedness. We rely on interoperability. And in my time at FDA, I was reviewing software, cybersecurity, interoperability, wireless coexistence, and EMC, because that's what I came from. I came out of Carnegie Mellon's Dependable Systems Laboratory, where I was doing research while getting my master's in ECE. I came from an environment where everything had to be high availability, high reliability. If you're building a missile defense system, 1% is not good enough. You know, if you can say that you're available all but 1% of the time, you're still down enough time that, oops, a nuclear missile just hit my city. That's no good. So you have 5 nines of expectations there. That's much more rigorous than expectations in medical devices. And that's a good thing, because that costs bazillions of dollars and we can't afford healthcare as it is, right? So there's this balancing act that we have to find. And how did that balancing act affect us when we had CrowdStrike outage? Well, healthcare got hit harder than anyone. I want you to think about that for a minute. Healthcare as a sector got hit harder than any other sector. Why? Because healthcare has more rigorous requirements than almost any other sector, banking being very, very similar in terms of expectations for confidentiality, availability, and integrity. But healthcare got hit the hardest. And they said that basically there were more than 1 million individual devices in healthcare organizations throughout the US that were hit when CrowdStrike was affected. So hospitals reported varying effects and extent of the outage. Some clinics had every single computer down. Others had some laptop and desktop workstations down. Often those are used to access EHRs. Well, if I can't access my EHR, oops, I can't do a lot of the things I, as a clinician, would need to do, right? Labs indicated that the outage impacted their ability to deliver lab results. That can delay hospital discharge, hospital admission. It can delay treatment. That's a pretty significant issue. So in terms of the outage itself, not too many medical devices were affected, but healthcare as a sector, 1.94 billion in losses. That is where people who put their money into funds want to go, they keep getting hit again and again. Maybe I shouldn't invest over there. But if we don't invest over there, our healthcare systems will fail. We can't not invest in healthcare, right? So what can we do about it? Obviously, they have some insurance. Unfortunately, it looks like insurance policies may only cover 10 to 20% of losses. That means you're stuck hanging out there in the wind with 80% to 90% of your losses. It's excruciating. The total cost of the outage to US-based Fortune 500 companies is estimated at 5.4 billion. So 2 of those billion are sitting in healthcare. The rest are downstream. They're banking, they're airlines, and other sectors. But if you look at the major places where the outage affected, healthcare and banking were the 2 big ones in terms of sector loss. Direct losses per company were highest at airlines. Again, why? Well, oops, all our systems went down, literally all of them. That shut all flights down. You can't revert to paper for airlines today. There's just too much complexity.
The Department of Transportation said that they were responsible for lodging and all of the things for their affected clients.
Right. And how do you do that when your system that allows you to connect to all those other sectors is also down, right? I don't now have the list of hotels unless I happen to have it printed out at my desk of who am I supposed to call? What are their phone numbers? You know, what are the codes I'm supposed to use to let them know what the condition is under which they have agreed to help me? You need all that information when you're sitting there. And, you know, whenever you're the traveler and you get to a situation and you're stuck and they're not being very helpful, it's extremely frustrating. But when I'm the traveler and I get into those situations, I have to remind myself, the person behind the desk is not the reason that this is a problem. And I can't take their head off for it, right? We have to be fair to them. They don't like this any more than we do as a traveler. So, you know, it's excruciating to be in this position of, all right, all travel across the United States and to a great extent, much of Western Europe and some parts of East Asia, they all came down all at the same time. The world grinds to a halt, but it really doesn't, right? It really couldn't. The worst part of all this is that it appears that cyber criminals are now taking advantage of the outage and started offering up malware claiming that it can fix the problem. So now you're like, oh, here's somebody promising that they can fix my outage with CrowdStrike, and you go download something and try and put it on your computer and whoops, yet another problem, right? So a situation like this outage breeds new opportunities for even more problems. It looks like there's a question in the Q&A. How could one have prevented this outage as a CrowdStrike service user? Well, that's a great question. The only way you can think of solving the potential for unavailability would be to use two different technology stacks and run resilient systems, half protected by CrowdStrike and half by Microsoft or some other vendor. That is one option. There are other options, and we'll get into some of those thoughts later. But you know, part of what makes medical devices somewhat immune to this this outage is related to that, is related to what you can do. To deal with these kinds of problems and how you can sort of protect yourself. So let's talk about Falcon in medical devices for a minute. We have not heard at MedCrypt specifically of a medical device that was affected.
Oh, who's this? Good morning.
Rick, can you mute?
Sorry, hold on just a sec.
You are, but
Yeah.
I'm in the middle
Okay.
of a meeting. Who are you calling from?
I don't think I can mute him.
I can.
Unfortunately, thank you. So we at MedCrypt have not heard specifically of a medical device that was affected. We did see a possible screenshot of one device that may have been a blue screen of death, but it's not clear that that actually related to this incident. It could have been any time that somebody happened to take a snapshot of this this very large system in a hospital that happened to have a blue screen of death on it. So I would take that with a grain of salt. I'm curious if any of you have heard about a specific medical device that was affected, but I have not heard of one, which is indicative of something. What is it indicative of? Well, we don't think that there are that many medical devices that would implement something like CrowdStrike Falcon. Why? For one thing, vendor patches are typically validated and approved by a medical device manufacturer before broadly being deployed. There's a hint in there, broadly being deployed. You may run it in a test environment. You may do a slow rollout and slowly expand your rollout. That is one mitigation to something like this. If you're really reliant on something like CrowdStrike, you roll it out, but you roll it out incrementally. And once you've seen that it doesn't go down, you have your sort of canary in the coal mine situation. If that device doesn't fail and it's operating as intended for X amount of time, then we can further roll out. And we roll out sort of exponentially across our install base. That would be one option. Typically, there are not that many devices where OS patches are directly deployed without MDM approval. Often devices that are incorrectly configured might have that problem, but these would be exceptional in the medical device area because one of the critical elements of the quality system for a medical device is that you have confidence in what your system is doing and how it's functioning, and that you know what its software bill of material is at any given time. And FDA is actually really harping on that today, that you know your SBOM. If you're allowing other third-party softwares to update themselves automatically without double checking how that functions before it rolls out to your devices in the field, you might have a problem. So most of the medical devices that we see are also dedicated purpose systems, which means they're not as likely to use tooling like Falcon. Falcon is really for enterprise systems. It's not for a single purpose system that says, all I do all day long is run this MRI and take these results and pass them off to downstream users or something like that. So that is, I think, our best understanding for why we didn't see a lot of outage in medical devices. They're just not using CrowdStrike Falcon. Healthcare delivery organizations, on the other hand, were heavily affected because they are trying to use something like CrowdStrike Falcon to protect their EMRs and EHRs. Those are often the machines that were impacted. They've often stated that they've had to cancel scheduled appointments or were slowed down when they switched over to paper. And that is what they had to do for those few days while they were figuring out how to de-outage themselves in this situation. So we know that impacts were felt across HDO systems, servers, computers. Providence, for example, indicated 15,000 servers and another 40,000 computers were affected. That's out of an ecosystem of something on the order of 150,000 computers in totality. So that's pretty broad.
Can you think of a device or a category that is big enough that it would justify the expense of having Enterprise Falcon for devices?
Off the top of my head, no. I mean, there are definitely a fair number of medical devices that are deployed today that run operating systems like Windows.
Right.
And you would want some tooling on them to provide assurances that they will not have malware, that they're not going to be running unexpected processes, but these are tightly locked down devices. You don't
I'm sorry,
allow.
which ones are?
the devices of this nature that run something like Windows operating system. If you go to the biohacking village at DEF CON, you'll see one of the most common problems that arises when people put their devices out on a table is that somebody walks by and goes, "Ooh, that's a Windows-based system. Let me see if I can kiosk escape it." What that means is, the kiosk idea is that when you approach the system, it only allows you into the elements that you're supposed to use for the medical device's purpose. And you're not supposed to be able to gain access or privilege to other elements of the system. In other words, the behind the scenes part of the actual operating system. I'm not supposed to do Control-Alt-Delete and be able to get the system to go into the file directories, and I shouldn't be able to access those. That is a failure that often occurs, is that the developer of these devices did not think, like, if I hit escape 5 times in a row, ooh, guess what? The system lets me in and gives me more privilege than I should have.
Pure speculation, not on the record or anything. What percent of medical devices do you suspect are hackable?
Ooh, most. I mean, speculation.
Most, like,
right?
more than 50%?
Many devices that are on the market today have been on the market for 20 years, 30 years. Are they true legacy in the sense that IMDRF labels them legacy? They cannot be patched. Some of them are truly legacy. Some of them can be patched, but not very well. I'm going to leave that hanging for a minute. Not very well. So if I just look at older systems that have been out for 8 or more years, 8 being when the post-market guidance came out and people started thinking like, oh boy, FDA might enforce this at some point because we're supposed to be managing the post-market behavior of our devices. If I look at those devices, the vast majority of them probably can at some point be hacked. They're not all networked though. So that means I have to get into a facility and walk in with my toolkit and open them up physically. So if you look at the vectors, the CVSS vectors, it asks you, what's the attack vector? Is it networked? Is it adjacent? Is it physical? If I got to show up with my Dremel kit and like grind the thing open to get into its case and start poking into the JTAG ports or some other debug port, can I do it? Yeah, sure. The running joke around here is that I do walk around with a battery-powered Dremel. It's not actually true, mine's wired, and I have to plug it in. But yeah, I'm an engineer, and what I used to do was field test DoD systems and try to break them in the field. That's an expertise
You
I
know how
have.
to have a good time. I want to party with you.
I love what I've done for a living all of these years. I do break things. I'm good at breaking things. That's part of why I'm in cybersecurity, because the people who are good at breaking things are the ones who can tell you how to prevent it.
I am calling in today from a hotel. I'm on a short day trip to a very old city in Washington State. And we went to a bar last night that is the oldest in the state, from 1889 or something like that. And I told my partner to watch out. These steps were not OSHA approved. They were like this big. And the floor was definitely, so yeah, I can relate. There are legacy systems in the street here.
There are legacy systems everywhere we look. And the reality is that most of them are easily broken if you just know, the couple things to do with it. But that comes back to this question of motivation. FDA and other regulators will tell you, don't sit down and try and think about, what is the motivation? Because there are entire books written by anthropologists on the topic of what motivates hackers. All it takes is, I feel like doing it. And then you're motivated. And, if you're bored and you're smart, you can be pretty destructive. I've told my colleagues that if I ever get bored, I will find a polite way to hand off my work and move on, because it's not a good thing for me to get bored. That's why I left FDA. I kind of got bored. I was doing really exciting work, and that sort of came to an end, and I was being asked to just shampoo, rinse, repeat with reviews, and I got bored. Not a good thing, right? When we talk about how to prevent these kinds of breakdowns, we need to be thinking on our feet. We need to be agile about it. Bureaucracy is not usually agile. So, when we think about what the regulator is supposed to do, when they tell you these are the rules, they're trying to write them really broadly and generally for a reason, because it's going to change, right? This is an evolving environment, and we have to deal with evolving problems. we've got another comment. EMIS web went down in the UK, which impacted several digital triage medical device systems managing
Yeah,
patient bookings. It's the same
I've bored
problem.
Richard on camera now. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, hiya, Joe. So I think, yeah, I think there's almost a kind of pre-cloud and post-cloud. So there's a lot of medical devices that are based on connected services.
There are.
And there's a growing kind of prevalence of, certainly in the UK, national systems, like national pathology and radiology systems, where you would expect the core infrastructure of appropriate protections. In fact, medical device regulation kind of requires it. So some of the physical stuff that's been stuck in a cupboard for 20 years was probably protected as a result of its obsolescence from this kind of this kind of outage. But there's been 3 or 4 instances where attacks in the supply chain recently have had a knock-on impact on health provision. Synovis had a bit of a ransomware event back in the UK back in June, and I think 10,000 appointments were cancelled as a result of it taking down systems across in London. And I think there was a recent one over in the States where Canuti Health, were hacked back in February and detected it in August and lost about 500,000 patient records. So I think going forwards, this is only going to be more of an issue. And when this happened, I think I was on the call, and I said to you, Joe, it's ironic that the thing that is trying to protect against outages is actually cause the outage on this instance. Unless you have 2 completely separate technology stacks, it's really difficult to see a way around how you can kind of maintain a 100% resilient system if somebody in your supply chain does something stupid.
Mhm.
Well, and or just doesn't do anything at all, right? I mean, one of the biggest problems with software bills of material is 80 to 90% of the software that's being used to build devices today is open source. How much of that is actually actively maintained? Nobody knows. When the federal government says they're going to throw, I don't know, what was it, $11 million at open source software, I sort of laugh. I'm like, where are you throwing it at? Joe Smith up the street who writes software on his free time on Sundays? I mean, really, who are you targeting with that? It's almost incomprehensible to me. Like, what can we actually do with this stuff, and how can we make the ecosystem better when the ecosystem is kind of a hydra? Cut off one head, 3 new ones appear. It's just too diverse and too wild of a frontier. So, in terms of the actual impacts, though, we really haven't heard of impacts on medical devices themselves. We've heard of it only on the healthcare side. Why so little about this impact? Falcon's a third-party tool with OS level permissions. That's typically not going to be built into a medical device with a dedicated function. The failure could lead to a system crash during a critical function of the system. Shockingly, yep, I'm trying to get people to fly on my planes and my system goes down. That's a critical function. Oops. The failure and the outage that CrowdStrike created is something that medical device manufacturers are largely going to try to avoid building into their devices. They're typically very cautious about the tooling they use and for what purpose they're using it. Medical device manufacturers are acutely aware of availability requirements. So even if CrowdStrike promises we are 99.999% available, 5 nines, medical device manufacturer might say, you know what, I might not need to use that aggressive a set of tooling if my device is connected and protected by these other elements, this defense in depth structure, and I have malware software running on it to check. And I do periodic, but not automatic updates of my malware files and what I'm searching for with my malware tools. So you're not going to see a lot of actual impacts with medical devices. It's really the EHRs that got hit. So what can I tell from FDA? Like, is there chatter here? There are 0 signals in the recalls database. There are 0 signals in the MOD database. Those are medical device reports where an actual incident occurred and potential patient harm happened. There are no results for CrowdStrike, for Falcon, and I put no relevant results for Falcon because there are other terms that Falcon might appear in, but they're not specific to CrowdStrike. There are no results for Windows Blue Screen of Death. None. FDA's cybersecurity news page does not mention the CrowdStrike outage. It does mention Origin 11. It does mention Log4j. It does mention Swinetooth. I was actually there for those. That was not fun. What does it mean when it doesn't make the news page? It doesn't mean that FDA didn't hear about it. I guarantee you that they had a fun day of phone calls. That's what it was like when I was there for Log4j, for Urgent 11. Doesn't mean they didn't investigate impact. It just indicates that they didn't have any findings that they deemed worthy enough of sharing through their website. I want to emphasize that. FDA spent all day having fun with that. I promise you, based on my experiences in past incidents. It just didn't carry through in a way that it was like, oh no, we're going to have somebody lose a limb or a life because of this outage. What can an MDM actually do to minimize the impact? This is where that root cause analysis report comes in. Go read it, review what they tell you about. And I'm happy to share the slides afterwards if somebody wants a PDF copy, because those links.
Please, in fact, please do, and go ahead and please do that. And if that here is a live link, go ahead and click on it, please, and then we can copy paste the URL in the chat for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. All of the URLs are live, and I will share a PDF version of this so that you all can go through it and utilize the information. I always include URLs and make them linkable so that people afterwards can dig more deeply into this information. Why do I say you should go read their root cause analysis report? It gives you hints into how their validation processes fail. Why do you care? Well, because it can help you review your validation processes. I'm a big fan of validation. Huge fan of validation. I've done a lot of software and hardware integrations over the years. Software and hardware that is quite complex, much more so than the modern medical devices. As I said, I worked in defense for a good while. 3 layers of requirements might be typical in medical devices. 6 layers might be typical in defense. So, you really got to get in there and validate stuff right. Do you have devices that allow third-party software products to leverage the kernel drivers? If you're a medical device manufacturer and you say yes to that, I'd ask you, is it worth it? Go back and do a risk-benefit analysis. Take a look at everything in that root cause report and say, one of the things they said about mitigation is considering stage deployment for your software update rollouts, if this is practical. Oh boy, I think that would be a good idea. That is one way that you can avoid this problem, is you roll it out very slowly. You see that inner ring of rollout. Did anything bad happen? No, I can roll it out a bit further. Did anything bad happen? No, I can roll it out further. CrowdStrike is now talking about doing that with their software update rollouts. That would make a big difference. It would not impact all 8 million users at once. It might impact 10,000 the first round. If it impacts 10,000, that's a bad problem, but it's a lot less bad than 8 million. And do you give customers control of your deployment of updates? Now they're talking about giving customers control of the CrowdStrike updates. That's a massive change for them. What else can you do? Know what is in your software supply chain. Do you have a complete SBOM? And I said complete because I've seen medical device manufacturers say, oh, we did a risk analysis and we only included the components that are risky. That's not what FDA is asking for. And they have statutory authority to tell you that you have now violated the act if you give them an incomplete SBOM. Please don't do that. Are you monitoring your SBOM for vulnerabilities? If your answer is no, guess what? You're in violation of the act. If you are monitoring, how often? If it's once a year, that's not often enough. If it's once a day, you're probably overkilling it, but kudos to you. If you have tooling that does it for you, even better, because you don't have some poor analyst sitting there going, oh, I have to read this stupid thing again. What do you do when vulnerabilities or worse, exploits are noted in your system? How quickly and completely are you remediating these things? Are you tracking the following metrics? And these are copied directly out of the FDA pre-market guidance. So if you're more interested in what those are and why they're there, FDA is wanting to see that manufacturers are doing something about it. They're very serious about that. What else can you do? Maintain an incident response plan, planning and preparation, identification and triage, technical and clinical containment, restoration and eradication, recovery and documentation, follow-up analysis, which feeds back to planning and preparation. When we talk about your quality management system, we're talking about a total product lifecycle, secure product development framework. All of these things that happen in the post-market need to feed back into your pre-market. If you have software vulnerabilities listed associated with your SBOM, guess what? Go look up what the CVEs are. Go look at the CWEs, the common weaknesses associated with those, and see whether or not your coding standards are telling you to avoid those things. If you're not doing that today, you don't actually feed back properly between your post-market and your pre-market. You should be doing that. I'm not saying it's easy. It's easy to say it, but you should be doing that. If you have an incident response plan, are you training to it? Your whole staff could be affected with a complaint. Any one of your staff, if you're a medical device manufacturer who wears your shirt, if you have a shirt that says Philips and I walk up to you on the street and say, hey, we were using your device the other day, you have to handle a complaint. If you're not trained for incident response and that complaint sounds like a cybersecurity event, what are you going to do about it? You need to be trained, and somebody within your organization should make sure you're testing it. Exercise your incident response plan. Tabletop exercises are really, really useful. FDA has a link on their website for a regional incident preparedness and response playbook, but that's targeted at HDOs, not at the medical device manufacturers whose devices are employed there. Why? It's targeted at HDOs because they're the ones hit with most of the attacks. Sometimes through devices, more often, traditional social engineering and phishing. We know that that's how University of Vermont medical system went down. It was just good old phishing, right? It took them down for a good long while. Their immediate incident response happened and their playbook ran out at day 2. They were still responding and reacting and continuing the recovery months later. Months later. If you ever have a chance to listen to Nate Couture talk about that incident, do. He's a fantastic speaker, and he's being very, very, very transparent about how the situation happened and what went wrong for them. And they had a very sophisticated incident system in place, and it still didn't get them very far. Really important elements. If you don't know how to do any of these things I'm talking about, reach out and ask me, because that's what we do all day long. We help
How many
people.
folks do you guys have now?
What's that?
How many employees do you have at MedCrypt now?
Last time I counted, it was over 50.
Wow.
My team, the services team who do consulting work from design all the way through, getting you through the door with the regulator and out the other door with the regulator is about 9. We've got staff who are cybersecurity SMEs, and we've got project managers who help us run through these projects, which can include solving 20 odd cybersecurity deficiencies.
Our next in-person meeting is in May in California. Pretty much every year I invite MedCrypt, but I know it's busy. So now we have a third contact, if not Mike, if not Vidya, or all 3 of you, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have others too, but it comes down to how many other things are we juggling and how busy are we in projects.
I know.
But at the end of the day, I'm really interested in hearing if anybody has seen a specific medical device outage. I'd love to hear about it, especially if there's an impact to patient care. What I'm more interested in, though, is telling you all, like, these are the key things you got to be doing. If you're having trouble with any of these things, please reach out. If my team can't handle it for you, we know people who can. It is really critical for the regulators today, and this is worldwide, it's not just FDA, that you've got these areas covered. They may be more or less explicit in their guidance or their laws as to whether you have to include threat modeling overtly or built into some other element like risk management. But whether you're talking MDR in Europe or dealing with PMDA in Japan or MFDS in Korea or Health Canada, they're all largely following the IMDRF. And guess who's on the IMDRF working group for cyber? It's FDA and Health Canada. So they're really aiming for consistency across the board with respect to cyber expectations. And they're really aiming for one-stop shopping. If every regulator agrees that they're going to ask for the same thing, you write one submission package and you're through everybody, and you do it the same way. So your cybersecurity expectations are harmonizing in a really nice way. If you can put a package together for FDA, you've almost completely put your package together for Europe, other than that little question of GDPR. The same thing.
I would encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide. I am going to thank Naomi for a great conversation and ask you again, please do share this presentation, because I'm sure there'll be more than one person who will want to refer to it later. Profound thanks. Our next meeting is May 6, 7, and 8 in Newport Beach. Maybe pencil it in, and I'm sure we'll be talking again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this week. I'll see you same time next week. Bye for now.
Great. Thank you.